Hello everyone, in today's video I'll be reviewing Spider-Man from 2002. I'll be reviewing the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies for the next movie reviews. I won't be reviewing Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man movies, not yet. That'll be like in the near future. Right now I just want to focus on the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films at the moment. Spider-Man is another iconic character right up there with like Batman and Superman. What makes Spider-Man so great is how relatable the character is. Unlike Batman and Superman, who are adults, Spider-Man is a teenager that was very groundbreaking in comic books at the time, and rare to see a teenager as a superhero. Most of the time, teenagers in comic books were mostly sidekicks. Spider-Man from 2002 was made by Columbia Pictures and Marvel Enterprises. The film was distributed by Sony Pictures Releasing. Spider-Man was directed by Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi, as we all know, is a horror director who directed movies like Raimi. Sam Raimi, as we all know, directed horror movies like the Evil Dead films, Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Drag Me to Hell, and created the comic book movie Darkman. He also directed a western called The Quick and the Dead. And he did some drama movies like A Simple Plan, The Gift, and For Love of the Game. And he also recently directed the Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Spider-Man was produced by Laura Ziskin, who was a well-known film producer. She had her own production company called Laura Ziskin Productions. She produced movies like What About Bob, As Good as It Gets, and was also an executive producer on Pretty Woman, and was also produced by Ian Bryce. The screenplay was written by David Cope, and the music was done by Danny You all know, who has done a lot of film composing for Tim Burton films. The movie stars Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, William Dafoe, James Franco, Cliff Robertson, and Rosemary Harris. Spider-Man was released on May 3rd, 2002, and made $825 million at the box office. Spider-Man is about high school senior student Peter Parker. He is bitten by a radioactive spider and develops superpowers of a spider, with spider senses, climbing walls, and shooting web out of his wrists. After the death of his uncle, he vows to use his powers for good and fight crime. Peter Parker remembers his Uncle Ben's words of advice: with great power comes great responsibility. Just like Batman and Superman, Spider-Man is another comic book icon. He's another one of my favorite comic book characters, and was my first love for Marvel comic books. Despite that I'm a big DC fan, I still love and enjoy Marvel comic books. I'm neutral. I love DC and Marvel. DC is just my favorite and preference, that's all. Spider-Man made his debut in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1962. Just like Batman and Superman, there are so many different versions of the characters. There are many different comic books, movie adaptations, video games, the 1990s cartoon, which I grew up watching as a kid. In the 1970s, there was a Spider-Man TV show, which I've heard of, but honestly, I never really have seen an episode of that series. I know that TV show came out during the same time as the Incredible Hulk TV show with Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. In the 1960s, there was a Spider-Man cartoon where the episodes were basically reciting the comic books of the Spider-Man comics at that time. It was okay, but it was nowhere as good as the 90s cartoon. I have it right here on DVD. Back when my father first bought this in the 2000s, around the time like when they were promoting the Spider-Man movies, my dad got this like online for like around like maybe like $10 or something. Buying it today, it's like over like $50 or $60 today or something like that. Like any superhero movie that I've mentioned on my channel, this movie went through development hell for years. Back in the 80s and 90s, an idea for a Spider-Man film was being developed and worked on, but it never came to materialize because of creative differences, and Stan Lee, the creator of Spider-Man, was not happy and satisfied how the studios wanted the film to be turned down for a Spider-Man film at that time. Back in the 1980s, film directors like Roger Corman and Tobe Hooper were considered to direct a Spider-Man movie, but Stan Lee did not want to make Spider-Man into a horror movie. In the 1990s, James Cameron was considered to direct a Spider-Man movie, and Leonardo DiCaprio was supposed to play Spider-Man. And despite their success with Titanic, James Cameron was rejected, and Leonardo DiCaprio turned it down, saying he was not really interested in playing a superhero at that time. Sam Raimi was hired to direct Spider-Man because he is a huge die-hard comic book fan, and he also loves Spider-Man comic books. Before directing Spider-Man, he had long wanted to direct a comic book movie. He originally wanted to direct a Thor movie, and was also considered to direct Batman '89 and Batman Forever after when Tim Burton stepped down as director after Batman Returns' his mixed box office performance. And he was also considered to direct The Shadow with Alec Baldwin. When Sam Raimi was turned down, rejected by studios for not directing a superhero comic book movie, he decided to make up his own comic book character. That's why he made Darkman, because Darkman is not based on any comic books. It was just something he made up for himself. It's hard to believe this movie came out 20 years ago. In 2002, I was 8 years old when this movie came out. I saw Spider-Man in the movie theaters with my parents and my older sisters when I was a little kid in 2002. Around this time of big movies like Lord of the Rings or other big blockbuster films that came out, on a Friday or Saturday night, me and my parents would go to the movies, and sometimes because of the movies crazy popularity, the tickets were sold out like crazy. So my parents had plan B. What we do is get up early in the morning, go get breakfast at a diner, and go see an early show of the movie, rather than going at night. Seeing this movie in the movie theaters blew my mind away, made me a Spider-Man fan. It got me to reading the comic books and watching the animated series and reading more Marvel comic books after that. It was an experience I'll never forget. When this movie was being promoted and marketed, there was a teaser trailer of bank robbers robbing a bank. They fly in a helicopter to get away. Spider-Man catches the bank robbers and leaves them hanging on the World Trade Center. Because this was post 9/11 at the time, Sony had to remove that teaser trailer and had to change the teaser trailer because it was too soon and sudden and tragic what happened at the time when 9/11 happened. When you look at Spider-Man's eyes, you see the World Trade Center. At that time, that was a tribute to the 9/11 victims who died. For me, it's really hard to remember how I found out about this movie at the time was being marketed and promoted before I saw the movie. It's not like nowadays where there's the internet where people know about when the next Batman or Superman or Spider-Man movies come out. This was pre-internet at that time. The only way people found out about movies is through the magazine or newspapers. As a little kid at that time, I knew about that teaser trailer, but I just can't really remember if I saw it or I don't remember if I saw that as a little kid or if I saw that years later as an adult until YouTube and the internet at the time. As a kid around Christmas time, my parents got me the toys of this movie and of course the DVD of this movie. Unlike in today's modern world where people have so many access to so many movies, or movies come out so fast on home media than they used to be. As a kid growing up, I had to wait 6 months for the movie to be released on DVD around Christmas time. There was no such thing as online streaming services in the early 2000s. There was no Netflix, no Hulu, no Amazon Prime, no Disney Plus either. Heck, Marvel was not owned by Disney yet in 2002, not until at least 2009. Rewatched this movie recently for this movie review on my channel. In my own personal opinion, this movie holds up very well. The movie may not be 100% like the comic book, but it's as good as it gets and as close as you get to the origin story told of Spider-Man come to life. It's one of the best comic book movies ever made. It's also one of my favorite comic book / Marvel films. The story is great, very well developed, has a great arc, really captures the premise of Peter Parker's origin story told well and come to life. Seeing him get bitten by a radioactive spider, wake up the next day with superpowers. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man / Peter Parker was great and perfect. Tobey Maguire is my favorite and still the best Spider-Man actor to date. You really felt like Peter Parker was real and came to life in the comic books. What's also funny, just like how Michael Keaton and Hugh Jackman, fans were skeptical of him being casted as Spider-Man, and no one could think he could pull it off. When fans saw the movie, they were like, oh wow, he was great, we were wrong, he's great and perfect. He nailed it as Peter Parker. Shy, smart, brilliant, feels like an outsider, no one respects him, he gets bullied by Flash Thompson, he's too shy to talk to a girl and ask her out on a date. Very relatable, but I was not a scientist, I wish. And of course, he's great as Spider-Man. When Peter Parker is bitten by a radioactive spider, he discovers he has superpowers, but he has to learn to control them and learn how to use his powers properly and not lose control. When he wakes up the next day, no glasses, better posture, he has confidence, and he defends himself against Flash Thompson and beats the shit out of him. Peter Parker thinks with these superpowers he can become rich and famous. When he goes to the wrestling ring to win $3,000 to buy a car to impress Mary Jane, he gets ripped off by the fight promoter, only gets $100. A robber robs the place, and because of being mad at being ripped off, Parker lets the robber get away. After letting the robber get away, Uncle Ben is murdered. This sets Peter off on a rage to find the guy who killed his Uncle Ben. When Peter Parker finds out the man who killed his Uncle Ben, only to find out realize that was the man who he let get away with the money at the wrestling place. Peter realizes from that moment he feels guilt, regret, and grief. Thinking that he had stopped the robber, his Uncle Ben would not have been murdered and still be alive. Peter also learns an important lesson that fame and money was not the answer to his superpowers. He remembers his uncle's advice. With great power comes great responsibility. Just like in the comic books, Peter Parker lives with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. They don't have a lot of money, and his Uncle Ben struggles with employment because of his age. Just like in the comic books, we don't know who Peter Parker's parents are. It's a mystery and unknown. Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris were perfect and are the best actors to have played Uncle Ben and Aunt May. But Cliff Robertson was a well-known actor in the past. He won an Academy Award for Best Actor in the sci-fi movie Charlie. Seeing Uncle Ben die was sad and tragic for Peter Parker, losing someone who was more like a father to him than an uncle. William Dafoe as Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, is great. His character is like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type character. This movie has some horror elements, especially how Sam Raimi directed the Evil Dead movies. When he's all alone and talking to himself in the mirror and shows his multiple split personality disorder and the guilt for killing the board of directors, he has no memory because he was the Green Goblin, not him. Norman Osborn has an estranged relationship with his son because he expects more from him. The first fight scene between him and Spider-Man at Times Square is awesome and epic. The Green Goblin asks Spider-Man to join him. He refuses because what sets him different from Spider-Man is that Spider-Man does not kill, he protects the innocent. The way Norman Osborn finds out who Spider-Man is at Thanksgiving is great. The Green Goblin attacks Aunt May, sending Peter Parker a message threatening his loved ones. When the Green Goblin kidnaps Mary Jane, he gives Spider-Man an ultimatum and a choice to save her or the kids on that high train. I'm not really sure what you call that, and I apologize, I'm not an engineer. It was a homage to the Spider-Man comic book the night Gwen Stacy died, Amazing Spider-Man issues number 121 and 122. But instead of Gwen Stacy, it was Mary Jane he saves, and she did not die, unlike Gwen Stacy in the comic books. The final showdown fight between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin was awesome and great. But man, Spider-Man gets his ass kicked really bad. Me and my friends in school used to reenact these scenes as kids. When the Green Goblin tells Spider-Man that you spun your last web and is going to kill Mary Jane, that gets him mad, angry, and ready to fight back. Spider-Man is beating the shit out of him. The Green Goblin unmasks and tries to trick Spider-Man to try to kill him. Unaware of his spider senses, Norman kills himself and falls into his own trap. Norman's last dying words were, "Peter, don't tell Harry that he was the Green Goblin." Kirsten Dunst, man, I tell you, back in the day, she was in a lot of things in the early, the mid-late 90s and the 2000s, from child actor, teen, and adult actress. She's great in this movie as Mary Jane Watson. Just like in the comic books, hip, free-spirited, fun. Also an actress, but not a model like in the comic books. Actually, I don't really know if Mary Jane Watson was an actress in the comic books, to be honest. But one big difference they did in this movie, unlike in the comic books, Mary Jane was not the first girl Peter Parker falls in love with. The first girl that he falls in love with was Liz Allen, the very beautiful, popular cheerleader girl. Then he falls with Betty Brant, Jameson's secretary, Gwen Stacy. They really jumped the gun a few steps ahead on girlfriends for Peter Parker in this movie. And yes, I know and I'm aware that Mary Jane means marijuana. I had this old DVD interview with Kevin Smith, interviewing Stan Lee, asking about his creations of Marvel comic books, and how did he get away with the name Mary Jane. Even Stan Lee himself said he did not know that Mary Jane means marijuana. The first time I learned that Mary Jane means marijuana was in high school from some stoner. After learning what Mary Jane means, my childhood went out the window that day. Because as a kid growing up, anytime I heard the word Mary Jane, the first thing that came to mind was, well, one, actually no, two things. The candy Mary Jane and Spider-Man's girlfriend. But now I think of three things when I think of Mary Jane. Marijuana, Spider-Man's girlfriend, and the candy. In the comic books, Aunt May wanted to set up Peter Parker with Mary Jane on a blind date. Peter Parker avoided her as best as he could because he did not want to be set up on a blind date from his aunt. Nobody wants that. In issue number 42, Peter Parker finally meets Mary Jane Watson for the first time. He's like, wow. Her first words are, "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot." Too bad that line was not in this movie. In the recent MCU movies, post-credit scenes, this could have worked as a good post-credit scene in this movie if they had thought of that. But then again, this was pre-cinematic universe, and the post-credit scenes in, Marvel and superhero films were rare at this time. Despite Harry Osborn being friends with Peter Parker, he feels jealous because of his father liking Peter Parker more than him, because he's not a scientist like his father is. He's also jealous of Mary Jane being in love with Spider-Man and Peter Parker. Harry defends and sticks up for Peter in high school. There's not a lot to say about James Franco as Harry Osborn until the sequels. He's good in this movie, but he's more developed later on in the series. J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson was flat out perfect. He is the character. Again, it's like J. Jonah came to life from the comic books. Just like the comic book, he is a jerk, sarcastic, he hates Spider-Man, gives him a bad rep, wanted people to believe he's a criminal, not a hero. And despite Peter Parker working for J. Jonah Jameson, taking photos of himself, he treats Peter Parker poorly, like all teenagers. I had a music teacher back when I was a little kid in school. He always found the part funny when Peter Parker tells J. Jonah, "You don't trust anyone." And J. Jonah responds, "I trust my barber." Too bad he wasn't in the movie that much. Excelsior, Stan Lee's cameo number 4 in this movie. Too bad they cut his line out in the movie offering Peter Parker a pair of sunglasses they wore in the X-Men movie. That could have been cool and funny. At least he saves a little girl's life. Good old Stan. But I also doubt they were not thinking of setting up a cinematic universe around this time period. Watching this movie as a kid compared to now as an adult. In 2002, there was no internet or YouTube film goers like there is now that I've noticed pointed out minor flaws that did not occur to me as a kid. Because as a little kid, you're not critical with movies compared to as an adult. Or also how nowadays people have pointed out the little small minor flaws and details that I just did not catch or notice as a kid or even as a teenager until I started watching other moviegoers and other film critic YouTubers. For example, the CGI when Peter Parker jumps from across from building to building, or when Spider-Man jumps across the balloons at the parade fighting the Green Goblin. It's like a poorly video game graphic bad design. Some of the CGI does not hold up very well today, but this was 2000s CGI. It was still improving around this time. Some people have also complained about some of the dialogue being corny and cheesy at times. Well, if you read the comic books, that's the way Spider-Man talk. "That's a cute dress. Did your husband give it to you?" "It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind. Let mom and dad talk." People also joke about when the Green Goblin uses tear gas to knock Spider-Man out. He says, "Sleep, Spider-Man." They joke it's like he farted or something. It also never occurred to me how the Green Goblin suit looks like a Power Ranger costume rather than the original Green Goblin comic from the comic books. But it is what it is. Despite a poor costume design, William Dafoe is still great in this movie as the Green Goblin. Despite these minor flaws, this is still a great movie. It was another big hit for Marvel around this time, right after the success of Blade, which was a hit, but it wasn't really a big hit like this movie was and the first X-Men movie was. Because compared to X-Men and Spider-Man, Blade was a minor Marvel character compared to X-Men and Spider-Man. It was also another big hit and rebound for comic book fans after the disaster of Batman and Robin. This is a must-watch and must-see for Spider-Man diehard comic book fans. It's a movie that I always love rewatching again. It has a special place in my heart for nostalgia. So that was my review of Spider-Man from 2002. Like the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell, get the latest updates on my YouTube channel, and stay tuned for next time for Spider-Man 2 from 2004. See you next time.